Hi, welcome to another how-to webinar from Sumo Logic. Today we're going to be talking about scheduled searches and in particular about how to create alerts out of your scheduled searches. My name is Mario Sanchez and I run training here at Sumo Logic. So let's get into the agenda. We're going to be learning how to use the scheduled searches to monitor your environment. We'll talk about the different alert types. So you can actually send your messages, your alerts through email or script action, ServiceNow, Webhooks, Save to Index. We'll talk about each one of these different alert types and the different options associated with it. Last but not least, I want to talk about creating meaningful alerts. So the mechanics for creating an alert is incredibly simple. However, I want to talk to you guys about what makes sense when it comes to an alert to make sure that you're not just creating noise and you're creating alerts that are really actionable, alerts that really point out your critical events. So for those of you who are brand new to Sumo Logic or getting started, I always give you the 30,000 foot view. Sumo Logic, the data flow is, the first step is getting your data into Sumo, so what we call data collection, and we do that through collectors and sources. Once the data is in Sumo, then you search and analyze that data using Sumo Logic operators. But what we're going to be talking about today is this third option, which is starting to monitor your data. And in particular, we're going to talk about alerts. So how to create scheduled searches out of your existing searches so that you can start alerting on those particular ones. All right, so what are scheduled searches? You probably heard me talk about scheduled searches and alerts interchangeably. So let me clarify this a little bit. A scheduled search is pretty much your standard search that has been saved and it's been set up to run at a specified time interval. This is a great tool for monitoring your continuous stack, for continuously monitoring your stack. Now, you can use a scheduled search to set up what we call a condition or a threshold, and if that threshold is met, it could trigger an alert. So once you have a saved search, you can set up a condition to trigger an alert if a certain condition is met. Those alerts can go out through various channels. As I mentioned, it could be email, it could be script action, ServiceNow connection, webhook, and Save to Index, and I'll talk a bit about each one of those in a second. So let's talk first about the mechanics. It's incredibly simple to save an alert, to schedule and save an alert. So once you have your query, you click on Save, you say Schedule this search, and then it's down to three main steps. You specify this frequency, you specify the time range and time zone, and the second one is you specify that condition or that threshold you want to meet. And last but not least, you specify the alert type. So let me show you how to do this in the UI using a very simple alert that I've built for myself. Just to give everybody context in here, what I'm doing is I'm looking for my source category equals Apache Access. So anything that, all my Apache Access data, but then I'm saying I really only care for those messages that have a status code of 404. So I want to do an alert on my count of 404s. I then time slice my data. So if you notice, I was pulling 60 minutes worth of data. I'm time slicing it 1 minute, and then I'm doing a count of all the messages that I'm getting with status code of 404 by time slice. And that gives me something like this below. So you notice at 9:16, I had 214, a count of 214. At 9:19, I had 201, and you get the point. Here is my count of 404s for that particular time. Let me refresh that data so that we can see it. Okay, here we go. Here's my count broken by time slice. Now, what I can do here is I can say, well, let me actually add a threshold. I really only want to see whenever my count is greater than 200. So if I click start on that again, I will only see those time slices where my count is greater than 200. And these are the ones that I would like to alert on. So from an alerting perspective, it's as simple as saving that query. In this case, I already have a name because I've saved it before. I can then say schedule this search and specify the frequency. Do I want it to run daily, weekly, every 2 hours, or how often do I want it to run? Let's say I want it to run on an hourly basis. I can then specify how much data do I want it to go pull. So let's say go back and pull 60 minutes worth of data. What time zone do I want that last 60 minutes to be on? So in this case, I'm choosing my time zone. And then when I get to the alert condition, I can specify, I want this scheduled search to alert me every single time the search is complete. Or probably more interesting, I only want you to alert me if the following condition is met. And the conditions are normally based around the number of results that you're going to get. So if you remember, we put a where clause in here saying, if the count is greater than 200, then I want to see some results. So if I have something that says where my number of results is greater than 0, that means that if I do not have any counts that are greater than 200, I will not get any results, and therefore I will not get an alert. But if I were to have any counts that were greater than 200, I will get results, and therefore I will get an alert triggered. Now, the last thing I need to set is the alert type. I could specify one of these, and we'll talk about those in a second. Let's keep it simple for now. I'm going to choose email, and I can say I want this alert to be sent to mario@sumologic.com. And as simple as that, I can trigger this alert, click on save, and this alert would be sending me a message every time there was a count greater than 0. We'll talk about these other details here in a little bit. Okay, so as you noticed, setting up your alerts, the mechanics are incredibly simple. Now, let's talk about each one of those steps. So from a frequency perspective, as you noticed, you can choose something like every 15 minutes, every hour, every 2 hours. For those of you who have played with scheduled searches before, you'll notice that we've added a few new options. We can say daily, weekly. Let me take you there, for example. I can say I want this to run on a daily basis. And in that case, I can specify I want it to run only on weekdays, or I want it to run only on weekends. Let's say weekdays at 6 a.m. And I can specify the frequency, or I could say weekly. Or the other option that you have in here is I want to actually specify a custom cron job. What this allows me to do is allows me to enter any type of cron job that I would like in here. In my example, for example, here I want this to run every Monday and Wednesday at 8 a.m. For those of you who are not that familiar with the cron syntax, I highly recommend cronmaker.com. You can actually, in very simple English, specify what you want it to run, and it converts it to the right cron syntax so that you can copy and paste into this particular box in here. All right. Then you also have to set your time range. So if you remember, I was able to choose something like 60 minutes or anything in this dropdown. But what if I wanted, let's say, the last 45 minutes, which is not shown in here? Then you can use the exact same syntax that you use in your searches, -45. Or I could say, I want -45 to -30, which means give me 15 minutes worth of data, but with an offset of 30 minutes ago. So again, you can choose from the dropdown, or you can use the syntax that we've already learned from the searches themselves. All right, going on in here, the next thing is setting up your condition and threshold. So in this particular example, I showed you how you can search for your Apache Access, only those messages that have a status code of 404. You can count them, but the key part of setting up your condition and your threshold is to add a where clause to your query. That where clause is going to determine how many results you're going to be seeing in your result set. In this particular example that I'm showing you in here, my results will only include time slices where the count of 404s is greater than 25. Or it's going to show me no results if there is a violation, if there is no violation. So same story with my query here. Remember, I had a count of 200. So if my number of results is greater than 0, that means I did have a time slice that had more than 200 messages, and I want to be alerted by it. Okay? All right. The last part that I want to talk about is the alert type. So you notice that I have various different types of alerts in here. Let me talk about each one of these so that you're familiar with how to implement them. From an email perspective, it's pretty straightforward. I specify the email. I could put commas and as many emails as I want. But the interesting thing comes here. I can specify what the email subject is going to look like. In my case, I put the phrase search alert : and then I'm using some variables to give me a little bit more detail about the alert. And that's going to determine what is going to be shown in here on my alert message. So if I go back to the UI and I hover over help, you see here on the right hand side the different variables that are available to your email subject. Next, I have the ability to include certain things in the body of the email. I can include the search query, the result sets themselves, a histogram in the email, and last but not least, I can also include the results of this query in a CSV attachment. Now, keep in mind, there is a maximum to this. It's only 5 megabytes worth of data or 1,000 results. And the reason for this is not meant to replace your export functionality. There is a way to export your results somewhere else. This is just meant to be a quick, easy way for you to get an alert with a limited set of results in your data. If I go back to that here is an example of a message that I received. Here is the query itself. Here is the histogram. Here is the result set. And of course, I can get an attachment to that email. So any of these checkboxes here allow me to do that. Now, for those of you who have played with email, with scheduled searches before, you'll notice that some of these features are new. There is a blog here that shows you all the different features and how to use them if you're interested to look into that. All right, one thing to note is that there is a limit as to the number of emails you can send per alert per day. It's not all the alerts per day, but per alert per day. So 120 emails is the limit, and if you think of it, that's quite a bit of emails per day, which means anything above that would actually be a lot of noise. So we try to minimize the amount of spamming that you're going to be doing by putting a limit to it. But just keep in mind that if you ever need to increase this limit, you can always open a support ticket and we can help you out with that as well. Okay, the next option that you have in terms of alert types is script action. If you notice in here, I can go and say, I want a script action. What script action allows you to do is it allows you to run a custom script of yours. And that script could be anything that you want. For example, I have a script here in my collector that allows me to run a firewall diagnostic process. So I have a script that goes off and runs a little bit of diagnostics on my firewall. Now, let me go back to this. The way that it works is within Sumo, you trigger that alert, and that alert is going to call a custom script of yours. There's a couple of things that you have to keep in mind. One is that script needs to be hosted on a local server of yours where you already have an installed collector. That's how Sumo Logic is able to communicate back to that custom script. It doesn't matter which collector, it only matters that it is next to or in the same machine as an installed collector. Second thing is that script has access to the search results. We can pass a JSON formatted text file to that script so that it can use that data to do something with it. Perhaps it wants to pass it on to other systems that you might have behind your firewall. That script can also call any other scripts if you wanted to as well. And the last thing to point out is that that script can be written in any of the following, like Ruby, Perl, Python, Shell. Essentially, when you create that script, you tell us what is it written on, where does that script reside, and if there is any working directory where you want us to drop off that JSON formatted file so you can have those results. So what you're hearing is you have the ability to create a custom script that can be triggered by the alert. And that script is usually a good fit when you want to connect to on-premise systems that might sit behind a firewall, like in this case. The steps for installing it, I'm not going to walk you through the UI, but it's pretty straightforward. You go to your installed collectors. In this case, I have an installed collector in here. And there's a little add button that allows you to add a new source, meaning I'm going to load more logs, or I can add a script action. And if you select add a script action, you have a screen that allows you to specify what operating system it runs on, what's the command itself, and where does the script reside. Notice, Sumo Logic has no knowledge of what the script content is. All we know is where does it reside so that we can kick off that script. Once that script has been set up, you can easily schedule it in your scheduled search, just like I did here. I have a couple of scripts already set up, so I can say I want this script to trigger when this condition is met. All right, the next one that I want to show you is a ServiceNow connection. From an alert type, you could have a ServiceNow connection. I don't have one set up because I don't have a ServiceNow account, and that might be the case for most of you. But basically, ServiceNow is a ticketing system similar to Jira, and a tight integration of Sumo logic with ServiceNow allows an alert from Sumo logic to open an incident ticket based on the search results in ServiceNow. And so in order to do that, you would have to build a ServiceNow connection. And once that connection has been built, you would be able to schedule a search against that connection. Probably more interesting to most of you here is the ability to send that alert through a webhook. So this is used to send alerts to any third-party tool that is going to be accepting the incoming webhooks. And this could be any tool that has a REST API. We have worked with some of the more popular ones with a Slack and a HipChat and a PagerDuty. That's why we let you get set up with some of the connections in here. But if you're working with a tool of yours that we haven't worked with before, you can just click on webhook and specify that payload from scratch. Let me show you. Once you have your webhook connection created, it's going to show up in here. So in this case, I have two different webhook created. I could be sending my message to Slack, and in this case, here is the payload that I have set up, that I have preset. But I could always customize it from here as well. Perhaps I wanted to call it Sumo Robot and specify it that way. How do you create those connections? Let me show you right now. It's pretty straightforward. You go into Manage. You go into Connections. Now, this is an administrative function, so maybe not everybody has access to it. You go to Manage, go to Connections, and from here, you see the connections I've built. You can, from here, create a new ServiceNow connection or any of these other webhook connections. If you notice, we've worked with Slack before, so we know what that payload looks like. So we get you started. But what if you wanted to create a connection to something we haven't worked with before? No problem. Click on webhook, and you can knock yourself silly here, entering the payload that your system is expecting. You can test the connection, you can save it, and once that is saved, it's going to be available in the scheduled searches available to you. All right, the last one that is in here is save to index. And the way that this works is you can save the results of your search into an index. Think of it into a small bucket. And the great thing about this is that that data can be searched later on. In this particular example, if I say alert type save to index, and I give my index name the name exception events, let's say that I was looking through my Windows logs, and I just pulled out all those events that are exceptions, I can put them into a smaller index, and then I can save them and search them at a later time. So if I were to go back to my query, I think I even have it here already set up for you. I can just say where index equals exceptions, and I can look for I can search against that particular bucket and only for the logs stored in that particular bucket, only the messages stored in that particular bucket. Okay? For those of you who are a little bit more advanced and you've actually worked with scheduled views, you probably are thinking, well, save to index sounds very similar to scheduled views. And it's true, they are very similar. And what we'll say is, rule of thumb, whenever possible, use a scheduled view because it offers other safeguards. It offers a lot of management features. For example, with a scheduled view, you can fill that scheduled view retroactively to your retention period. So it can look at data in the past, whereas a save to index only looks at data from now going forward because that's when you schedule that save to index alert. So just keep in mind, whenever you can, use scheduled views, but save to index is a very simple, it's a poor man's ability to store messages into another bucket if you wanted to. All right, so pretty straightforward. I've shown you how to create an index. I've shown you how to create an alert. I've shown you the mechanics of doing it. But the last thing I want to talk about is best practices around creating good alerts. There's a blog post here that you guys can link to that is showing you the principles of creating meaningful alerts. I highly recommend that you take a peek at it. However, let me summarize it for you. The two key principles it's talking about is alerts should be actionable. Oops, sorry about that. Alerts should be actionable and directed, meaning there should be a playbook. There should be an action to take after each and every one of the alerts. And someone should own that action. Someone should own that alert should be directed at someone, whether it's an individual or a group, who's accountable for handling the action for that alert. The third thing it talks about, but it doesn't highlight as a key principle, is that alerts should be dynamic, meaning the threshold itself should be dynamic. Let me explain it with a brief example in here. If you remember my query that I showed you initially, this one right here, this has a static threshold. It says if you have alerts, if you have more than 200 messages with a status code of 404, then highlight them and then alert me. But you notice that that 200 is static. In this graph, I'm showing you a case where the number of 404s went up, but when I looked a little bit further, I could see that my traffic in general also had a spike. Therefore, the spike in my 404s wasn't all that meaningful. Statistically, it just made sense for my 404s to go up because the rest of my data was going up. So it didn't necessarily call out. It was just a static threshold that was yielding me some false positives. Let me show you three different examples of how to create alerts, one better than the other one, and the last one better than the last two. So let me go back to the instance and just show you. Here's the first one, which I've already shown you. This is using a static threshold. Show me the counts, and if I have anything above 200, alert me. Here's the second one. This one's a little more interesting. Let me run it here for you. And what this is doing is, again, it's looking for Apache access, only those status codes of 404, messages with a status code of 404. I'm time slicing it and counting by time slice, so this is very similar to the previous one. But now I'm using an operator called an outlier. And here's a really cool thing about outlier. Let me show you the screen first. Outlier says, okay, here is that this dark blue line is showing me the count of my 404s, but the shaded area around it, which I'm going to show you a little bit better with this view, the shaded area around it is showing me the standard deviation, 3 standard deviations, because it looks at the previous data points and it figures out what the standard deviation should be at each one of these points. And whenever there's a violation outside of that standard deviation, it highlights it with a pink triangle. How does that convert into a table view? What happened is when I used that outlier operator, remember this outlier operator in here on the count with these options in here. This says, okay, use a window of 10, meaning go back 10 data points so that you can figure out what the standard deviation should be. And then use a threshold of 3 standard deviations. Show me every single time there's a violation. If I said 2 or 3 in here, it says, I only want you to tell me, give me a pink triangle only when you have 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 consecutive violations. But in this case, it says, show me every single violation in here. So the table looks something like this. And what it does is it shows me the count, and then it creates an upper limit, a lower limit, an error, an indicator, violation, a count, and a mean. A mean and a standard deviation. And that, with this data, I can statistically now represent my data in this way with pink triangles showing me when I should be alerted. So now these pink triangles, fortunately for me, translate to a 1 in my count violation column. So that's a 1 right there. So if I wanted to turn this into an alert, all I would have to do is say where count violation is greater than 0. That means if I have any violations, I'm going to get some results in here. So now the mechanics, as you guys remember, I'm going to just follow it through to show you. I schedule the search. I say, yep, I want to run, say, on an hourly basis with every 60 minutes. And my notification says, if the following condition is met, if the number of results is greater than 0, alert me. Now you notice how I can be alerted if I have results that are greater than 0, which in this particular case means my my standard deviation or oops, sorry about that. I shouldn't have used this word class for now. What that means in this particular case is my results are showing a situation where my 404s have grown increasingly larger than my previous 10 data points. So again, using Outlier to look at the previous 10 data points and then identify what the standard deviation should be. That is why you don't see data in this first 10 data points, because it took 10 data points for it to start identifying what the standard deviation should be. Great. Last thing I'm going to show you is a much more meaningful alert. In this particular case, I'm going to not only look at my standard, at my status code equals 404, but I'm going to look at those 404s in the context of my entire traffic. So my status code 200s is everything that actually, all my traffic and everything that actually had no issues. So now I'm looking for only those messages that are status code 404 and 200. Then I'm time slicing again, as I did before, but I'm doing something additional in here. I have an if statement saying, if my status code matches 200, then set this field to a 1. Otherwise, set it to a 0. I could have also written this like this, if status code equals 200. Why? Because I know I'm only going to get 200s or 404s. But I just wanted to show you that there is another operator called matches that looks for 401s, 402s, 403s, 404s. Actually, it even looks for 40, 400, whatever. So just another way of writing this. But if I want to make it simpler, I could do this. If my status code equals 200, create a new field with a whole bunch of 1s and 0s. 1 if it's at 200, 0 if it isn't. And I do the same for my 404s, a whole bunch of 1s and 0s, whether it is a 404 or not. So I have 2 new fields, successes and fails. I'm then going to take those fields and I'm going to sum them. Sum my successes as a new field called success count, and sum all my fails. Sum all those 1s and 0s and come up with a fail count by time slice. So now I have a count of all my successes, a count of all my fails by time slice, and I'm going to do something pretty cool. I'm going to do a ratio. I'm going to look at my fail counts divided by my success counts, and that's going to give me a failure rate. Now I have a pretty good idea. Let me run this query for you while I'm explaining it. I have a pretty good idea of when my increase of 404s is disproportionate to my increase of 200s, right? Because this failure rate, that's what it's measuring. It's measuring the rate of increase of my 404s in proportion to my 200s. So now if I apply my outlier on that failure rate, look what happens. I get my count of my successes count, my fail count, my failure rate, but now outlier is being applied on failure rate. So I have an upper, a lower for failure rate and all that good stuff. So now really what I'm looking at is, please tell me when my 404s increased at a higher rate than my 200s. I used a window of 5. Let's plot that out, and that looks something like this. It looks a little bit funny only because the scale is small, but let's change some of these axes in here, and let's make this go from 0.01 to 0.1 so we can look at this a little bit better. Hopefully that's going to work. And there you go. That's what my graph looks like now. I have some situations in here where the rate of increase of my 404s is way higher than my 200s, and that's what this is identifying. So I'm, instead of just looking at my count of 404s, I'm looking at it in the relationship of its context, of the entire traffic, and it's identifying those. Again, the simple thing to do here is go back to my table. Notice that a triangle means a 1, so I can as easily go in here and say where failure rate violation is greater than 0. If I have any violations, it's going to show it up with a result in here. So last time I'm going to do this just to show you mechanically how it's done. I can specify the time range. I can specify the time that I want it to run. And I can say if the following condition is met, which is number of results is greater than 0. So in this particular case, I would be alerted because I have at least 2 results, meaning that I have some violations, I have some pink triangles, and I can pick and choose which method I want to send that through. Great. So I have shown you guys how to create those alerts. You start by saving and scheduling them, then you specify the frequency and time range, you specify the condition and the threshold, Then you specify an alert type and whatever details you want to include for that alert type. I've also talked about alerts being actionable and dynamic. Actionable and directed. And last but not least, let's make those alerts be meaningful. Let's use dynamic thresholds so that you're seeing it in the context of what it is. The last thought I'm going to leave you with is I'm going to cancel out of this. Under help, you can look at our documentation, obviously, very extensive, and everything that I covered today is covered in there. You can open a support case. You can enter a feature request. And last but not least, you can go to our community. This is our forums, our community forums. Basically, it's a way for us to connect with a lot of our customers and have customers connect with themselves as well, with other customers. It's just a forums. You can go in here and say, I want to look for something like Outlier. I haven't used it yet and I want to see examples. So in here, you would have questions that other people have posted, as well as examples. Oh, look, there's that guy creating meaningful alerts. This looks very familiar to what we just talked about. As a matter of fact, is the exact same query. So we have tons of queries out here for you guys to copy and paste and be able to take advantage of. Most of the ones that we're putting out there that we think are good templates are tagged with the tag query library. So you can always go under topics, click on query library, and you will find here a whole bunch of sample queries that are very meaningful, not just for alerts and scheduled searches, but in general, including searches that a lot of our customers think that you guys could benefit from. So in this case, Salvatore who is a customer, has put a query on how to ignore everything but the one field in log compare that he cares about. Or here, Vlad has given you as an example on how to understand your logs by size. Here's another one to show you how to group your results into categories. So a lot of great examples of how to use some of the queries that are out there. Excellent. With that, I have nothing left to say, but thank you. Have a great day, and hopefully we'll see you in the next How To webinar. Thanks.